All right, good afternoon, class. I wanted to check in. I'm going to do sort of a really brief screencast. You probably think I always say that, but I'm actually just putting this one in because I want to bridge the gap and add a slide or two of material to a second screencast that's up that covers the remainder of my comments that I recorded last year as part of my treatment of this topic of the Cold War in Vietnam. So if you were in class today, this is all familiar to you. I'll just click through here. Talked about some of the assumptions that American containment policy was based upon, and the idea of providing these assumptions was the idea that American foreign policy, as far as the Cold War is concerned, didn't really allow for a whole lot of nuance or sophistication or exceptions. It was sort of black and white, and as is oftentimes the case with policies that are black and white, they can prove inflexible and sometimes in ways that are actually problematic. I think one of my suggestions here is that had the U.S. been on a different foreign policy course, it's quite possible that the conflict in Vietnam could have been managed more effectively with less loss of lives, money, and energy and effort that was put forth here. We left off today talking about Ho Chi Minh, and this is the part that I want to drive home before I hand you off to the second screencast, which talks about how the U.S. escalated its presence in Vietnam throughout the 1960s and into the 70s, but most of that escalation took place in the 60s. But you'll recall that Indochina, or what we will refer to for the purposes of the screencast, Vietnam, was a recent colonial possession of the French. And by recent, I mean going back to 1880. And after World War II, even though World War II had been a real source of humiliation for France and its role in the world, France, fell to Nazi occupation very quickly in World War II. But nonetheless, at the end of World War II, France emerged to try to reassert claims and reassert control and authority over its colonial possessions. And one of the most important of those was Vietnam. The French had relied upon Vietnam for various resources. Your textbook talks about some of them, but among the most important was rubber. And resources were still important to driving economies in the post-World War II era. But imperialism was increasingly not the way in which European countries looked to try to assert their control over things like resources and markets. But nonetheless, France comes a-calling and tries to reassert its claim. And Ho Chi Minh emerges very quickly as a powerful figure. He had already been involved in efforts to in resistance efforts and efforts to liberate and bring about the independence of Vietnam. But he had his number one priority determined for him when the French sought to return and reestablish claim to Vietnam. And one of the images that Ho Chi Minh put forward is that the Vietnamese can resist and succeed so long as they conduct themselves like a tiger. And the imagery went like this. Just as a tiger is smaller than an elephant, if a tiger sits still and it rests, then the larger elephant can impale the tiger on his tusks and destroy the tiger. But as long as the tiger keeps moving, keeps watch, remains vigilant, the tiger can tire the elephant out and then in time seize upon him. Throughout the 1950s, so the French really sort of revisit in the late 1940s. They return, starting in 1946, they return to Vietnam. But by the 1950s, things are not going well for the French, to the point that the U.S. even starts supporting and funding French military operations, providing as much as a third of the budget. And you might wonder why the United States would have wanted to spend this money and get involved in a conflict that perhaps didn't seem to involve the United States. But it all comes down to Cold War and containment. The fear was that Ho Chi Minh, among his many visions for the future of Vietnam, was to take the lands from the imperial colonizers and redistribute them among the peasantry of Vietnam. And Ho Chi Minh was a card-carrying communist in the sense that he believed in the validity of communism as a political philosophy. But in Vietnam, communism meant a fair amount. It differed pretty significantly from communism as it was understood, say, in the Soviet Union. In Vietnam, it meant redistributing land and resources to the people, and U.S. policy didn't really take the time or choose to understand some of these differences. So Ho Chi Minh was, as I mentioned already, a pretty strong believer in many aspects of American political principles, and he was hopeful that he could find common cause and be an ally of the United States. But the U.S. ideology in the Cold War was not one that could admit a communist nation into its alliance. So the U.S. was essentially pushing this quote-unquote third world region into the second world by virtue of some of the policies that its leader and leaders followed. So Ho Chi Minh is going to be disappointed, but not flat-footed. He, by 1954, the Viet Minh, the national movement in Vietnam, effectively bring about the final end of French occupation. The fall of Dien Bien Phu, which was a northern French military base and holdout in northern Vietnam, which was where communist influence was greatest. Dien Bien Phu falls in 1954, and the French are going to leave, and this becomes a really challenging moment for the United States. For one, it solidifies in Ho Chi Minh's mind that the United States is in fact the enemy. That is no longer a question. And it also starts the beginning of the National Liberation Front, which is an army of Vietnamese that is founded upon the idea of bringing about the end of U.S. or French occupation. So just briefly, let me say this, and then I'll turn you over to the second screencast. So in 1954, following the fall of Dien Bien Phu, the Americans and some of their European allies hold what becomes known as the Geneva Conference. And the question here is what to do with Vietnam now that France has left, now that France is leaving. And it's kind of a curious question because France is leaving because they were beaten by the Viet Minh in Vietnam. And that would have probably decided the question for a lot of people because, of course, if the Viet Minh, the National Alliance for the Independence and Liberation of Vietnam, is victorious, then it seems like Vietnam should fall to their control. Well, the United States calls this meeting and brokers a deal whereby Vietnam will be divided in half at the 17th parallel. North Vietnam will be communist, and Ho Chi Minh and his men can do whatever they want with it, but South Vietnam will remain free and loyal to the West. And the original agreement actually was that elections would be held in Vietnam to determine its future. But in the weeks and months immediately following the agreement to have elections, the U.S. is going to set up a puppet government in the South, and this complicates things tremendously and brings about events that will lead to the Vietnam War. The U.S. starts to channel $200 million per year into the puppet government in the South, led by No Dien Diem. And this is an effort to use money to support a regime that the U.S. is hopeful will be able to, over time, win out over the North Vietnamese. Nonetheless, it becomes evident rather quickly that there is not enough support for the West in South Vietnam. You could say that the leadership under Dien Diem, very much like the leadership in China under Chiang Kai-shek, is not going to be effective. It's not going to be up to the task. And so as a result, the U.S. has to determine by the mid-1950s what, if anything, it will do differently. And this brings us to the next slide, which I cover in your screencast in part 2. All right, thanks for listening.